In the shadowed halls of Crestwood Hall, a scream pierces the night. A young novelist lies dead, a silver letter opener in her heart. Why was Vivian Langley murdered? What secret did she uncover about the Ashburn family's past? And who among the elegant guests each hiding motives of greed, loyalty, or fear wielded the fatal blow? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Crestwood Hall. In the waning days of autumn, when the leaves of Somerset turned to shades of amber and crimson, Crestwood Hall stood as a monument to faded grandeur. The sprawling estate, nestled in the quiet village of St. Mary's Mead, was the ancestral home of the Ashburn family, its ivy-clad walls whispering tales of bygone opulence. On this particular October evening in 1928, the hall was alight with anticipation, for Lady Eleanor Ashburn had summoned a select gathering to her home. Under the guise of a weekend retreat, the air was crisp, the fire in the grand drawing-room crackled, and beneath the veneer of polite conversation, a subtle tension simmered. Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster from the village, sat quietly in a high-backed chair near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Her sharp blue eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, darted from face to face, observing the assembled company with the keenness of a naturalist studying rare specimens. She had been invited, she suspected, as a courtesy. Lady Eleanor's late aunt had been a dear friend, and Miss Marple's presence lent a certain quaint respectability to the affair. Yet, as she surveyed the room, she sensed an undercurrent of unease, as though the very walls of Crestwood Hall held secrets they were loath to divulge. The guests were a curious assortment, each a distinct thread in the tapestry of the evening. Lady Eleanor herself, a statuesque woman in her late 50s, presided over the gathering with an air of regal authority. Her emerald gown shimmered in the firelight, but her smile was strained, her eyes flickering with something akin to apprehension. Beside her stood her nephew, Mr. Julian Ashburn, a handsome man of 32 with a charming smile and a reputation for reckless investments. His wife, Clara, a delicate beauty with a penchant for nervous laughter, clung to his arm, her gaze flitting anxiously toward the other guests. Across the room, Dr. Henry Caldwell, the family physician, sipped his brandy with a thoughtful air. His weathered face and steady hands suggested a man accustomed to crises. Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease whenever they rested on Lady Eleanor. Next to him, Miss Vivian Langley, a striking young novelist with a penchant for dramatic gestures, held court among the younger guests. Her sharp wit and bold opinions had already sparked whispered debates in literary circles, and her presence at Crestwood Hall seemed to carry an air of purpose beyond mere socializing. Rounding out the party were Mr. Reginald Forbes, a solicitor, with a dry manner and an encyclopedic knowledge of the Ashburn family's affairs, and Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, a widowed cousin of Lady Eleanor whose pinched expression suggested a lifetime of unvoiced grievances. Finally, there was young Tommy Ashburn, Lady Eleanor's great-nephew, a lanky boy of 17 whose sullen demeanor and tendency to lurk in corners had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple. Dinner was served promptly at 7, the long mahogany table groaning under the weight of silver and crystal. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, though Miss Marple noted the careful avoidance of certain topics, money, for one, and the recent death of Sir Rupert Ashburn, Lady Eleanor's husband, who had passed under mysterious circumstances 6 months prior. The official verdict had been heart failure, but whispers in the village suggested otherwise. Miss Marple, ever discreet, had heard the rumors but reserved judgment. She preferred facts to speculation, and facts, she knew, had a way of revealing themselves in time. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier. Julian Ashburn's laughter rang a touch too loud. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for her glass, and Dr. Caldwell's gaze lingered on the empty chair at the head of the table, Sir Rupert's place, left vacant out of respect. Miss Vivian Langley, ever the provocateur, leaned forward, her dark eyes gleaming. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying a hint of challenge, "do you believe Crestwood Hall is haunted? They say Sir Rupert's spirit lingers, watching over his legacy." A hush fell over the table. Lady Eleanor's fork paused midway to her mouth, and for a moment, her composure faltered. "My dear Miss Langley," she replied, her tone icy, "I have no patience for ghost stories. My husband's legacy is in his family, not in fanciful tales." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing imperceptibly. The exchange was brief, but it carried weight. Vivian's question had been no idle jest. It was a probe, designed to elicit a reaction, and Lady Eleanor's response, though controlled, betrayed a nerve touched. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her mind already weaving connections. The evening drew to a close with coffee in the drawing room, where the guests dispersed into smaller groups. Miss Marple, content to remain on the fringes, listened as Julian spoke animatedly of a new business venture, while Clara excused herself, claiming a headache. Dr. Caldwell and Mr. Forbes engaged in a low, serious conversation by the window, their words inaudible but their expressions grave. Tommy, meanwhile, slipped out onto the terrace, his silhouette vanishing into the shadows. It was nearing 10 o'clock when a piercing scream shattered the quiet. The sound came from the upper floor, sharp and unmistakable. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and dread. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her heart quickening not with fear but with a curious anticipation. She knew that sound it was the herald of something momentous. Lady Eleanor rose, her face pale but composed. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice steady. "I shall see what's happened." But Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, set her knitting aside and followed at a discreet distance. As she ascended the grand staircase, her steps light but purposeful, she felt the familiar stir of her little gray cells. Something was amiss at Crestwood Hall, and she intended to discover what it was. Chapter 2. The shadow of death screams still echoed in the corridors of Crestwood Hall. As Miss Jane Marple ascended the grand staircase, her steps measured but swift for a woman of her years. The polished oak banister gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, but the air felt heavy, as though the house itself held its breath. Behind her, the other guests hesitated, their voices a murmur of confusion and alarm. But Miss Marple's focus was singular. She had heard screams before, screams of grief, of fear, of guilt, and this one carried the unmistakable timbre of discovery at the top of the stairs. Lady Eleanor Ashburn stood frozen outside the door to the library, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with shock, met Miss Marple's, and for a moment, the regal facade slipped, revealing a woman on the edge of panic. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's dreadful." Miss Marple approached, her expression calm but alert. "What has happened, Lady Eleanor?" she asked gently, though her eyes were already scanning the scene. The library door stood ajar, revealing a room bathed in the warm light of a single lamp. The scent of old leather and polished wood mingled with something sharper, metallic. Miss Marple stepped forward, her small figure dwarfed by the towering bookshelves, and peered inside. There, sprawled across the Persian rug, lay Miss Vivian Langley, her vibrant presence extinguished. Her dark hair fanned out like a halo, and her eyes, once so full of mischief, stared blankly at the ceiling. A letter opener, its silver handle, gleaming, protruded from her chest, and a thin trickle of blood stained her emerald green dress. Miss Marple's lips tightened, but she betrayed no hint of horror. Instead, she noted the details: the overturned chair beside the desk, the scattered papers, the half-empty glass of brandy on the side table. The window was closed, its latch secure, and the heavy curtains undisturbed. The clock on the mantelpiece read 10 minutes past 10. Its steady tick the only sound in the oppressive silence. Lady Eleanor, regaining some composure, spoke in a low voice. "I found her just now. I came to fetch a book for Dr. Caldwell. And this?" She gestured helplessly. At the body, Miss Marple nodded, her mind already at work. "We must not touch anything," she said firmly. "The police will need to see the scene as it is. Has anyone else been here?" "No," Lady Eleanor replied, then hesitated. "At least, I don't think so. I came straight from the drawing room after the scream." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the doorway, where the other guests were beginning to gather, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Julian Ashburn pushed to the front, his charming smile replaced by a look of genuine shock. "Good God," he muttered, staring at Vivian's body. "What's happened?" Clara, clinging to his arm, let out a small sob and turned away. Dr. Caldwell, ever the professional, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Let me examine her," he said, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Not yet, doctor," she said quietly. "We must wait for the authorities. But perhaps you could confirm. Is she beyond help?" Dr. Caldwell knelt briefly, careful not to disturb the scene, and pressed his fingers to Vivian's wrist. After a moment, he shook his head. "She's gone," he said, his voice heavy. "Dead for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. No more." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. 10 or 15 minutes, she repeated softly, her mind noting the time. The scream had come at 10 o'clock, which meant the murder had occurred shortly before. She glanced at the guests, now huddled in the corridor. "Who was in the drawing room when the scream was heard?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. There was a pause. Then Mr. Reginald Forbes, the solicitor, spoke up. "We were all there, I believe. Except, well, Clara had gone upstairs earlier, hadn't she?" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "I was in my room," she said quickly. "I had a headache. I didn't come near the library." "And young Tommy?" Miss Marple asked, noting the boy's absence. "He was on the terrace," Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Sulking, as usual. I saw him through the French doors just before the scream." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "And the rest of you were together?" "Yes," Julian said, a touch too quickly. "We were discussing business matters, weren't we, Forbes?" The solicitor adjusted his spectacles, his face impassive. "Indeed. Investments, mostly. Nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple's knitting, tucked into her reticule, remained untouched, but her fingers itched to hold the needles, to channel her thoughts into their rhythmic dance. Instead, she turned to Lady Eleanor. "We must telephone the police at once, and no one is to enter this room until they arrive." Lady Eleanor nodded, her composure returning. "I'll have Jenkins call them," she said, referring to the butler. She moved toward the staircase, but Miss Marple's voice stopped her. "One moment, Lady Eleanor," she said softly. "Did Miss Langley seem distressed this evening?" Did she mention anything unusual? Lady Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening on the banister. She was her usual self. She said carefully, "Bold, perhaps too bold. She asked about Rupert's death, as you heard, but nothing more." Miss Marple inclined her head, her mind cataloguing the response. Vivian Langley's question about Sir Rupert's ghost had been no idle remark, she was certain. It had stirred something in the room, something that had led to this violent end. As the guests dispersed, murmuring among themselves, Miss Marple lingered by the library door, her eyes sweeping the scene once more. The letter opener, the scattered papers, the brandy glass, each was a piece of a puzzle, and she would fit them together in time. The police would come, with their notebooks and their questions, but Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in the obvious but in the subtle. A glance, a pause, a contradiction. She would watch, and she would listen, and her little gray cells would do the rest. Chapter 3. The arrival of Miss Marple's inside police arrived at Crestwood Hall just before 11, their heavy boots echoing on the gravel drive as the wind whipped through the autumn trees. Inspector Hargreaves, a stout man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor, took charge with the efficiency of one accustomed to grim scenes. His sergeant, a lanky young man named Collins, followed with a notebook, scribbling furiously as the inspector barked orders. The library was cordoned off, and the guests were ushered back to the drawing room, where they sat in uneasy silence, their faces pale under the chandelier's glow. Miss Jane Marple, however, had not been idle. While Lady Eleanor telephoned, the authorities and the household staff hovered in anxious whispers. She had taken a quiet turn about the corridor outside the library. Her sharp eyes noted the polished floorboards, free of scuff marks, and the heavy velvet curtains that hung undisturbed. A small table near the library door held a vase of late-blooming roses, their petals pristine, suggesting no struggle had occurred nearby. These details, insignificant to the untrained eye, were to Miss Marple like the stitches in her knitting, each one essential to the pattern. Inspector Hargreaves began his inquiries with a brisk authority, summoning each guest to the morning room for questioning. Miss Marple, seated once more by the drawing-room fire, listened as the others were called one by one. She declined to be interviewed immediately, citing her status as a mere village acquaintance. But her mind was far from idle. She watched the guests' faces, noting the way Julian Ashburn's fingers drummed nervously on the arm of his chair, or how Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief into knots. Dr. Caldwell maintained a stoic calm, but his eyes darted to the door each time a footstep sounded. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove sat ramrod straight, her lips pursed, while young Tommy, who had reappeared from the terrace, slouched in a corner, his expression unreadable. It was during this tense interlude that Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her own involvement. She had not been summoned to Crestwood Hall by chance, she was certain. Lady Eleanor's invitation, though framed as a courtesy, had a purpose, perhaps to lend an air of normalcy to a gathering fraught with hidden motives. Or perhaps, Miss Marple mused, someone had known her reputation for unraveling mysteries, earned through quiet observation in St. Mary's Mead. Either way, she was here, and a murder had occurred under her very nose. Her little gray cells hummed with anticipation. Inspector Hargreaves emerged from the morning room, his face set in a frown. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I understand you were present when the body was discovered. I'd like a word." Miss Marple rose, her reticule in hand, and followed him to the morning room. The inspector sat behind a small desk, his notebook open, while Sergeant Collins stood by the window, pen poised. Now, Miss Marple, Hargreaves began. You're a friend of the family, I'm told. What can you tell me about this evening? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. I am but a humble acquaintance, Inspector, she said softly. I was invited for the weekend. Nothing more. But I can tell you what I saw. We were all in the drawing room after dinner, save for Mrs. Clara Ashburn, who had retired early, and young Tommy, who was on the terrace. At 10 o'clock, a scream was heard, and Lady Eleanor led the way to the library, where we found poor Miss Langley. Hargreaves leaned forward, his mustache twitching. And did you notice anything unusual? Anything out of place? Miss Marple paused, as if considering. The library was orderly, Inspector, save for the overturned chair and the scattered papers. The letter opener was an unusual choice of weapon, don't you think? So precise, yet so personal. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Personal, you say? Oh, indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice light. A letter opener suggests proximity, intimacy even. One does not stab with such a thing from a distance. And Miss Langley was a woman who provoked strong feelings. I suspect. Hargreaves scribbled a note, then looked up. You're observant. Miss Marple. Anything else? She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of her reticule. Only this, Inspector. The brandy glass on the side table. It was half empty, but there was no bottle nearby. Curious, don't you think, for a room so meticulously kept? The inspector grunted, clearly unsure whether to dismiss her as a meddling spinster or take her seriously. We'll look into it, he said gruffly. You may go. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her mind alight with possibilities. The brandy glass was a small detail, but small details, she knew, were the threads that unraveled the tightest knots. She resumed her seat, her knitting now in hand, and listened. As the others were called, Julian Ashburn claimed he had been discussing business with Mr. Forbes, a claim the solicitor corroborated with a nod. Dr. Caldwell said he had been in the drawing room, though he admitted to stepping out briefly to fetch his pipe from the hall. Mrs. Hargrove insisted she had not left her chair, her tone daring anyone to contradict her. Clara, trembling, repeated her story of retiring to her room, and Tommy, when pressed, muttered that he had been outside, smoking a cigarette, as the interviews concluded. Inspector Hargreaves addressed the group. No one is to leave the hall until we've completed our inquiries, he said sternly. We're treating this as murder, and everyone here is a suspect. A murmur of protest rose, but Miss Marple remained silent, her needles clicking steadily. She had already formed a mental map of the evening. The scream at 10, the body discovered minutes later, the alibis that aligned to neatly or not at all. Vivian Langley's death was no random act, she was certain. The letter opener, the brandy glass, the question about Sir Rupert's ghost, these were clues, each pointing to a motive rooted in the tangled relationships of Crestwood Hall. As the guests dispersed to their rooms under the watchful eye of Sergeant Collins, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the grand staircase. Somewhere in this house, she thought, was a truth waiting to be uncovered. And she, with her quiet ways and her little gray cells, would find it. Chapter 4. The Art of Observation. The morning after Vivian Langley's murder dawned gray and heavy. The sky over Crestwood Hall shrouded in mist that clung to the estate's ancient walls. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The guests, moving through the breakfast room with the cautious deliberation of actors in a play. They had not rehearsed. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table with a cup of tea and a modest slice of toast, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive acuity. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, a silent companion to her thoughts, which were as busy as ever. Inspector Hargreaves had stationed Sergeant Collins at the hall's entrance, ensuring no one could leave, and the investigation had begun in earnest. The library remained sealed, its door guarded by a young constable who looked both bored and nervous. Miss Marple, however, had no need to re-enter the crime scene. Her mind had already catalogued its details: the letter opener, the overturned chair, the half-empty brandy glass, and she was now more interested in the living than the dead. The breakfast table was a study in contrasts. Lady Eleanor, dressed in somber black, presided with a strained dignity, her eyes red-rimmed but her posture impeccable. Julian Ashburn, by contrast, seemed restless, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on the tablecloth as he avoided his wife's gaze. Clara, pale and fragile, picked at her food, her hands trembling slightly. Dr. Henry Caldwell ate methodically, his expression unreadable, while Mr. Reginald Forbes, the solicitor, reviewed a stack of papers with an air of detachment. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, her lips pursed, muttered about the inconvenience of the police presence, and young Tommy Ashburn, slouched in his chair, glared at his plate as if it had personally offended him. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. She noted the way Julian's gaze flickered toward Dr. Caldwell when he thought no one was watching, and the faint flush on Clara's cheeks when her husband spoke sharply to a servant. Mrs. Hargrave's complaints, though incessant, seemed calculated to draw attention, while Tommy's sullen silence was punctuated by occasional glances toward the library door. These were the threads of human behavior, and Miss Marple was adept at weaving them into a pattern. After breakfast, Inspector Hargreaves requested the guest's presence in the drawing room for further questioning. Miss Marple, as was her habit, positioned herself near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. The inspector began with Lady Eleanor, his tone respectful but probing. "Lady Eleanor," he said, consulting his notebook, "you stated you were in the drawing room when the scream was heard at 10 o'clock. Can you confirm the exact time you left to go to the library?" Lady Eleanor's hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It was immediately after the scream," she said. "I went upstairs at once to investigate. I reached the library within a minute, perhaps two, and you saw no one else in the corridor." Hargreaves pressed. "No one," she replied firmly. "The corridor was empty." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Empty, she thought. Yet the scream had been loud enough to rouse the entire house. Someone must have been close enough to cry out, and someone else close enough to wield the letter opener. She filed the thought away as the inspector turned to Julian Ashburn. "Mr. Ashburn," Hargreaves said, "you and Mr. Forbes were discussing business, you say. Can you be more specific?" Julian shifted in his seat, his charm replaced by a defensive edge. "Investments, as I said. A potential venture in London. Nothing to do with this, Forbes?" Hargreaves prompted. The solicitor nodded, his voice dry. "As Mr. Ashburn says, we were discussing a property deal. I have the documents if you wish to see them." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Documents could be produced to support any story, she knew, and Julian's quick agreement suggested a rehearsed alibi. She made a mental note to inquire further into the nature of this venture. Clara's interview was brief but revealing. Her voice quavered as she reiterated her claim of being in her room. "I heard the scream from upstairs," she said, her eyes darting to Julian. "I was resting. I didn't come down until I heard the commotion. And you saw no one else upstairs? Hargreaves asked. Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting, her handkerchief. No one, she said. But the pause was telling. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind noting the inconsistency. Clara's room was on the same floor as the library, yet she claimed to have seen nothing. A young woman with a headache might be inattentive, but not deaf. Dr. Caldwell's testimony was calm and precise. I stepped into the hall to fetch my pipe at perhaps 10 minutes to 10, he said. I was back in the drawing room when the scream came. I saw nothing unusual. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the doctor. His steady hands and measured tone suggested control, but his earlier glance at the empty chair at dinner hinted at a deeper connection to the Ashburn family. She wondered what secrets lay behind his professional facade. Mrs. Hargreaves' account was predictably indignant. I was in the drawing room the entire time, she snapped. I saw nothing, heard nothing until that dreadful scream. This whole affair is a disgrace to the family. Tommy, when questioned, was surly. I was on the terrace, smoking, he muttered. Didn't see anything. Didn't hear anything until the scream. Hargreaves raised an eyebrow. The terrace is directly below the library window, lad. You're telling me you heard nothing before that? Tommy shrugged, his eyes fixed on the floor. Nothing, he said flatly as the interviews concluded. Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of observations. The alibis were too neat, the denials too emphatic. She thought of the brandy glass again, its contents untouched since the night before. Why had Vivian been drinking alone in the library? And why had no one mentioned the papers scattered on the floor, papers that, on closer inspection, bore the Ashburn family crest? Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached Inspector Hargreaves. Inspector, she said softly, might I suggest examining the papers in the library? They may hold a clue to Miss Langley's purpose there. Hargreaves looked at her, surprised but intrigued. You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple, he said. We'll look into it. As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Vivian Langley's bold question about Sir Rupert's ghost. It had been a spark, igniting something in the room. And now, Vivian was dead. The connection was not yet clear, but Miss Marple knew that every clue mattered, and she would follow them to their inevitable conclusion. Chapter 5. The red herrings emerged. The mist that cloaked Crestwood Hall had thickened by midday, casting a pall over the estate that mirrored the growing unease within its walls. The guests, confined to the drawing room and dining areas by Inspector Hargreaves' orders, moved with the restless caution of caged animals. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner by the hearth, appeared to be engrossed in her knitting, but her eyes missed nothing. The click of her needles was a steady counterpoint to the murmurs of discontent, and her mind was as sharp as ever, piecing together the fragments of the previous night's tragedy. Inspector Hargreaves had spent the morning overseeing the collection of evidence from the library. The scattered papers, as Miss Marple had suggested, were gathered and catalogued, though their contents remained a mystery to all but the police. The letter opener, now confirmed as the murder weapon, bore no fingerprints, a detail that struck Miss Marple as both deliberate and telling. The brandy glass, too, had been sent for analysis, though the inspector confided to his sergeant that he doubted it would yield much. A glass of brandy, he muttered, hardly a smoking gun. Miss Marple, overhearing this as she passed the morning room, suppressed a smile. To her, the glass was more than a mere object. It was a question mark, a clue to Vivian Langley's state of mind before her death. Why had she been in the library, alone, with a drink she had barely touched? And why had no one else admitted to being there? The inspector's inquiries had taken a new turn, focusing on an obvious suspect. Young Tommy Ashburn. His sullen demeanor, his presence on the terrace below the library window, and his vague account of the evening made him an easy target. Sergeant Collins had discovered a cigarette stub near the terrace steps, still damp from the evening's dew, and Tommy's admission to smoking there placed him uncomfortably close to the scene of the crime. By noon, Hargreaves had called Tommy back to the morning room for a second interview, and the atmosphere in the drawing room grew taut with speculation. "He's just a boy," Clara whispered to Julian, her voice trembling. "They can't possibly think he did it." Julian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the door. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, ever quick to judge, sniffed audibly. "Boys of that age are capable of anything," she said. "Always sneaking about, up to no good." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Mrs. Hargrove. The widow's eagerness to cast suspicion on Tommy was curious, almost as if she wished to divert attention from someone else or herself. Miss Marple made a mental note of this, her thoughts drifting to the dynamics of the Ashburn family. Tommy, she recalled, was Lady Eleanor's great-nephew, the son of her late brother. His inheritance, if any, would depend on the family's dwindling fortunes, a topic that had been studiously avoided at dinner, as the afternoon wore on. Inspector Hargreaves emerged from the morning room, his expression grim. "Thomas Ashburn," he announced, "I'd like you to remain available for further questioning. The rest of you, carry on, but no one leaves the estate." Tommy slouched out behind him, his face pale but defiant. "I didn't do anything," he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. "I was outside, that's all." Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in his hands. Fear, she thought. But of what? Guilt? Or merely the weight of suspicion? She decided to speak with him later, in her own way, away from the inspector's probing glare. The focus on Tommy, however, had stirred the other guests into a flurry of whispered theories. Julian Ashburn, pacing by the window, suggested that Vivian's death might have been the work of an outsider, a burglar, perhaps, caught in the act. "The library's on the ground floor," he said. "Anyone could have climbed in." Dr. Caldwell shook his head. "The window was locked, Julian. You heard the inspector. No sign of forced entry. Then it was someone in the house," Mrs. Hargrove said sharply, her eyes darting to Clara. "Someone with access to the library." Clara flinched, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "Why are you looking at me?" she said, her voice rising. "I was in my room. I told you." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind turning over the alibis. Clara's insistence on her headache and early retirement was plausible, but her nervousness suggested more than mere shock. Had she seen something or someone in the corridor? And why had no one mentioned the papers on the library floor, which bore the Ashburn crest? Miss Marple suspected they were not mere correspondence, but something more significant, perhaps related to Sir Rupert's death, which Vivian had so pointedly raised. Determined to test her theories, Miss Marple excused herself and slipped upstairs, under the pretext of fetching a shawl. The corridor outside the library was quiet. The constable now stationed downstairs. She paused by the small table with its vase of roses, her eyes scanning the floor. There, near the baseboard, she spotted a tiny speck of ash, not from a cigarette, but finer, like the residue of burnt paper. She crouched, careful not to disturb it, and noted its proximity to the library door. Someone, she thought, had been careless. Returning to the drawing room, she found Lady Eleanor alone, staring into the fire. Lady Eleanor, Miss Marple, said gently, "Might I ask about Miss Langley's visit? She was a novelist, I understand. Was she researching something here?" Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. "She said she was working on a new book," she replied. "Something about family secrets, I believe. She asked to see our archives, but I thought it was just her usual flair for drama." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Vivian's interest in the Ashburn archives and her question about Sir Rupert's ghost suggested she had been digging into the family's past. Had she uncovered something worth killing for? The burnt ash, the scattered papers, the letter opener all pointed to a motive rooted in secrets long buried. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple resolved to keep a close eye on Tommy, whose sullenness might hide more than youthful rebellion. But she also knew that the true culprit was likely hiding behind a more polished facade, their guilt masked by the distractions of alibis and red herrings. Her little gray cells were at work, and she would not rest until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 6. A clue in detail. The second day at Crestwood Hall dawned with a chill that seeped into the bones, the mist outside thickening into a fog that obscured the estate's sprawling gardens. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, the guests moving through their routines with a wariness that betrayed their fear of Inspector Hargreaves' relentless scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple, however, found the tension invigorating. Her knitting needles clicked steadily as she sat in the morning room, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of those around her. The tiny speck of ash she had discovered outside the library door lingered in her mind, a small but significant thread in the tapestry of Vivian Langley's murder. The morning's inquiries had yielded little new information, much to Inspector Hargreaves' frustration. The papers from the library, he confided to Sergeant Collins within Miss Marple's earshot, were a mix of old correspondence and financial records, none of which appeared immediately relevant. Yet Miss Marple, who had a knack for seeing significance in the seemingly mundane, suspected otherwise. The Ashburn crest on those papers suggested a connection to the family's history, perhaps to Sir Rupert's death, which Vivian had so provocatively mentioned. As the guests gathered for luncheon, Miss Marple noted a subtle shift in their behavior. Julian Ashburn, usually so voluble, was subdued, his eyes darting to his wife, Clara, who sat pale and silent. Dr. Henry Caldwell maintained his professional calm, but his fingers gripped his fork a fraction too tightly. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, ever vocal, complained about the police's intrusion, her sharp tone drawing frowns from the others. Young Tommy Ashburn, still under suspicion, avoided eye contact, his sullenness now tinged with a nervous energy. Lady Eleanor, presiding over the meal, was a study in controlled grief, her every gesture precise but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Miss Marple's opportunity to probe further came unexpectedly after lunch, when she found herself alone with Dr. Caldwell in the conservatory. The glass-walled room, filled with wilting ferns and the scent of damp earth, offered a quiet retreat from the house's tension. The doctor was examining a potted orchid, his expression distant, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "Dr. Caldwell," she said softly, her knitting in her lap, "you must have known Miss Langley well, attending to the family as you do. Did she seem preoccupied during her stay?" The doctor started slightly, then recovered his composure. "She was a lively young woman," he said carefully, "always asking questions, poking into things. She was curious about Sir Rupert's death, as you heard at dinner. I told her it was heart failure, nothing more. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. And yet, she said, her tone mild. Her question seemed to unsettle Lady Eleanor. I wonder why. Caldwell's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flash of something guilt, perhaps, or caution. People grieve in their own way, he said. Sir Rupert's death was a blow to the family. Miss Langley's remarks were tactless. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the doctor's careful choice of words. Tactless, perhaps, but Vivian's question had been deliberate, designed to provoke. Had she suspected foul play in Sir Rupert's death? And had that suspicion led to her own? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a discreet turn about the upper corridor, her steps silent on the thick carpet. The library door remained sealed, but she paused by the small table with its vase of roses, her eyes searching for further clues. The speck of ash was gone, likely swept away by a diligent housemaid, but her memory of it was vivid. Burnt paper suggested secrecy, a document destroyed to hide its contents. She glanced at the library door, wondering what the scattered papers might reveal if examined more closely. Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Young Tommy Ashburn appeared at the end of the corridor, his hands in his pockets, his expression wary. Miss Marple, he said, his voice low. What are you doing up here? Merely stretching my legs, dear boy, she replied, her smile disarming. And you? You seem troubled. Tommy shrugged, but his eyes darted to the library door. They think I did it, he muttered. The police. They keep asking about the terrace, the cigarette. I didn't see anything, I swear. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. Of course, Tommy, she said gently. But perhaps you heard something. A sound, a voice, before the scream. He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting. I thought I heard someone moving upstairs, he admitted. Round 10, maybe a bit before. Footsteps, like someone was in a hurry, but I didn't see who. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Footsteps, she repeated softly. How very interesting. And you told the inspector this? Tommy shook his head. He'd think I was making it up to save myself. Besides, it was nothing clear. Just a feeling. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Footsteps in the corridor, just before the scream, placed someone near the library at the critical moment. Clara had claimed to be in her room. Lady Eleanor had been downstairs, and the others had their alibis. But alibis, Miss Marple knew, were only as strong as the truth behind them. As Tommy slunk away, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, where Inspector Hargreaves was reviewing his notes with Sergeant Collins. She approached him, her manner deferential. Inspector, she said, have you considered the possibility that Miss Langley was in the library to meet someone? The brandy glass suggests she was settled, perhaps waiting. Hargreaves raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. A meeting, you say? Any thoughts on who? Not yet, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. But the papers in the library, with the Ashburn crest, might they relate to Sir Rupert's estate? Miss Langley was a novelist, after all, with a nose for secrets. The inspector jotted a note, his skepticism tempered by her earlier insights. We'll look into it, he said. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the footsteps Tommy had heard. A hurried movement, a clandestine meeting, a document burned to ash. These were the threads of a deeper truth. Vivian Langley had been searching for something, and someone had ensured she would never find it. Miss Marple's little gray cells were weaving a pattern, and she was determined to see it through. Chapter 7. More lies. Surfaced fog that enveloped Crestwood Hall showed no sign of lifting. As the second day drew to a close, its gray tendrils curling around the estate like a shroud. Inside, the tension among the guests had grown palpable, their polite facades fraying under the strain of suspicion and confinement. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner of the drawing room, observed the shifting dynamics with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her knitting needles moved rhythmically, but her mind was far from idle, piecing together the fragments of Vivian Langley's murder with the precision of a seamstress, stitching an intricate pattern. Inspector Hargreaves' investigation had intensified, his questions growing sharper as he probed the inconsistencies in the guests' alibis. The focus on young Tommy Ashburn had not abated, but Miss Marple sensed that the boy was a convenient distraction, a red herring, perhaps, for a more cunning culprit. Her thoughts kept returning to the speck of ash she had found, the footsteps Tommy had heard, and the scattered papers in the library. These clues, combined with Vivian's pointed question about Sir Rupert's ghost, suggested a motive rooted in the Ashburn family's past, one that someone was desperate to keep buried. The evening brought a new development. As the guests gathered for a subdued dinner, Inspector Hargreaves announced that the papers found in the library included a draft of a letter, written in Vivian Langley's hand, addressed to Lady Eleanor. The contents, he revealed, were cryptic, but suggestive. "I know what happened last spring. The truth will not stay hidden." The room fell silent, the weight of the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Lady Eleanor's face paled, her fork clattering against her plate, while Julian Ashburn's jaw tightened, and Clara's eyes widened in alarm. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze flickering over the table. The letter was a bombshell, confirming her suspicion that Vivian had been digging into the circumstances of Sir Rupert's death. Last spring, she mused, was when Sir Rupert had died, officially of heart failure. Vivian's note suggested otherwise, and her murder suggested someone feared her discoveries. After dinner, Miss Marple sought out Clara Ashburn, who had retreated to the conservatory, her nervous demeanor more pronounced than ever. The young woman stood by a wilting fern, twisting her handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle air, her knitting tucked into her reticule. "Mrs. Ashburn," she said softly, "you seem troubled. Is there something you wish to share? These are trying times, and a burden shared is often lighter." Clara's eyes darted to the door, as if fearing eavesdroppers. "It's nothing, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just can't believe Vivian's gone. She was so vibrant." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind alert. "Indeed, she was, and bold." "Asking about Sir Rupert at dinner. Did she ever speak to you about her research? About the family, perhaps?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. She asked me about Rupert's illness," she admitted. "A few days ago, when she arrived, she wanted to know if he'd been unwell for long. I told her it was sudden, that's all." I didn't know what she was getting at. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "And was there anything unusual about Sir Rupert's death? Anything that troubled you?" Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might break. But then she shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, nothing. It was just a shock. I was in London at the time, visiting friends. Julian and I both were." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. Clara's alibi for Sir Rupert's death was convenient. but her nervousness suggested she knew more than she was saying. The mention of London, too, was curious. Had she and Julian truly been away? Or was this another carefully constructed story? As Clara excused herself, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to another avenue of inquiry. She sought out Mr. Reginald Forbes, the solicitor, who was in the library's anteroom, reviewing documents unrelated to the crime scene. His dry manner and precise speech made him an unlikely suspect. But Miss Marple knew that the quietest individuals often held the deepest secrets. "Mr. Forbes," she said, her tone light, "you must know the Ashburn family's affairs better than most." Miss Langley's letter suggested she was interested in Sir Rupert's death. Were there any irregularities in his estate? Forbes adjusted his spectacles. His expression guarded. "The estate was in order," he said curtly. "Sir Rupert's will was clear. Lady Eleanor inherited the bulk, with provisions for Julian and Tommy. Miss Langley's interest was, I assume, a novelist's fancy for scandal." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but her death suggests otherwise. Tell me, were there any disputes over the will? Any unexpected changes before Sir Rupert's passing?" Forbes hesitated, a rare crack in his composure. "There were discussions," he admitted. "Sir Rupert considered altering his will in the months before his death. He mentioned a legacy for a distant relative, but nothing was finalized." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. A potential change to the will was a motive indeed, especially if someone stood to lose or gain by Sir Rupert's death. She thanked Forbes and returned to the drawing room, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The evening grew late, and the guests' nerves frayed further. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrave's sharp tongue lashed out at Tommy, accusing him of sneaking about the night of the murder, while Dr. Caldwell's calm facade began to crack, his eyes darting to Lady Eleanor with increasing frequency. Miss Marple noted these tensions, her little gray cells weaving a web of connections. Vivian's letter, the burnt ash, the footsteps in the corridor, and now the hint of a disputed will. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple paused by the library door, now unguarded in the quiet hours. She thought of Vivian, bold and inquisitive, lying dead with a letter opener in her chest. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the lies and half-truths that were beginning to surface. She would watch, and she would listen, and soon the pattern would be clear. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Third day at Crestwood Hall brought a subtle shift in the air, as though the fog that clung to the estate's grounds had seeped into the hearts of its occupants. The guests, worn by 2 days of suspicion and confinement, moved with a weary tension, their conversations stilted and their glances guarded. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the fraying tempers with a quiet intensity. Her needles clicked steadily, a metronome to her thoughts, which were now focused on the web of lies that had begun to unravel. Inspector Hargreaves' investigation had grown more aggressive, his questions probing deeper into the guests' pasts. The revelation of Vivian Langley's cryptic letter, "I know what happened last spring. The truth will not stay hidden," had cast a shadow over the household, particularly over Lady Eleanor, whose composure seemed increasingly strained. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, sensed that the truth was close to surfacing, like a bubble rising through murky water. Someone, she was certain, was on the verge of breaking. The opportunity came unexpectedly after luncheon, when the guests dispersed to avoid the inspector's relentless inquiries. Miss Marple, seeking a moment of quiet, found herself in the conservatory, where Clara Ashburn stood alone, staring at the mist-shrouded gardens. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes red from unshed tears, and her hands clutched a crumpled handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. "Mrs. Ashburn," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft as a breeze, "you seem quite distressed. Is there something you wish to confide? I find that sharing a trouble often brings relief." Clara started, her eyes darting to Miss Marple with a mix of fear and desperation. For a moment, she seemed to teeter on the edge of silence, but then her resolve crumbled. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I can't bear it any longer. I saw something that night, before the scream, but I'm so afraid." Miss Marple's needles stilled, her heart quickening though her expression remained serene. "What did you see, my dear?" she asked, her tone encouraging but firm. "The truth, however painful, is always better brought to light." Clara's breath hitched, and she glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone. "I wasn't in my room the whole time," she confessed, her words tumbling out. I went to the library just before 10. I needed to speak to Vivian. She'd been asking questions about Sir Rupert, and I thought she knew something about Julian." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "About your husband. What did you fear she knew?" Clara's hands trembled, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "Julian, he's been in trouble. Financially. He borrowed money, a great deal of it, from Sir Rupert before he died. When Rupert passed, the debt was forgiven, but Vivian, she was asking about the family's finances, about the will. I thought she suspected Julian of something dreadful." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clara's confession was a vital thread, tying Vivian's inquiries to a motive for murder. "And what happened in the library?" she prompted gently. "I saw her there, writing something," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "She looked up, startled, and told me to leave. She said it wasn't safe to talk there. I left, and then I heard the scream a few minutes later. Oh, Miss Marple, I should have stayed. Maybe I could have saved her." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on Clara's arm. Though her thoughts were elsewhere, Clara's story confirmed the footsteps Tommy had heard hurried, perhaps fleeing the library. But it also raised new questions. Why had Vivian felt unsafe? And what had she been writing? "You must tell the inspector this," Miss Marple said firmly. "It is important, Clara, for the truth to come out." Clara nodded, her face crumpling. "But Julian, he'll be furious. He told me to say I was in my room, to avoid trouble. He said it would look bad if anyone knew I'd been near the library." Miss Marple's lips tightened, but she kept her tone gentle. "Your husband's advice was well-meaning, no doubt, but the truth will serve you better. Go to Inspector Hargreaves, my dear, and tell him everything." As Clara left, her steps hesitant but resolute, Miss Marple's mind buzzed with new connections. Julian's insistence on Clara's alibi suggested he, too, had something to hide. The financial troubles Clara mentioned, tied to Sir Rupert's death, pointed to a deeper motive. Had Vivian uncovered evidence of foul play in Sir Rupert's demise? And had someone, perhaps Julian, silenced her to protect that secret? Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, where the other guests were gathered under the watchful eye of Sergeant Collins. Julian Ashburn paced by the window, his agitation evident, while Dr. Caldwell sat with a medical journal, his calm facade betrayed by the occasional glance toward Lady Eleanor. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, her expression sour, muttered about the scandal tainting the family name, while Tommy slouched in a corner, his eyes fixed on the floor. Lady Eleanor, seated by the fire, caught Miss Marple's gaze and offered a tight smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained, "you seem remarkably composed amidst this chaos. Have you any theories about poor Vivian's death?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "Theories, Lady Eleanor, are like my knitting, best formed stitch by stitch, with care. But I do believe Miss Langley's curiosity about your late husband's death may have led to her own." A flicker of alarm crossed Lady Eleanor's face. Quickly masked, "She was a novelist," she said dismissively, "always chasing stories. I doubt she found anything of substance." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind noting the deflection. Lady Eleanor's composure was admirable, but her fear was palpable. The letter, the ash, the footsteps all pointed to a truth buried in the events of last spring, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. As the evening drew on, Clara's confession to Inspector Hargreaves sent ripples through the household. Julian's face darkened when he learned of it, and a heated exchange between husband and wife echoed faintly from the corridor. Miss Marple, listening quietly, knew that the emotional turning point had arrived. The lies were surfacing, and with them, the truth was drawing nearer. Her little gray cells were at work, and she would not rest until the pattern was complete. Chapter 9. The trap is set. Fog that had shrouded Crestwood Hall for days began to lift on the third evening, revealing a sky pricked with stars and a chill that sharpened the senses. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension, the guests' nerves frayed by Clara Ashburn's confession, and the mounting pressure of Inspector Hargreaves' investigation. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the drawing-room fire with her knitting, observed the scene with a quiet intensity, her little gray cells weaving together the threads of Vivian Langley's murder. Clara's admission that she had been in the library just before the scream had shifted the dynamics of the household, and Miss Marple sensed the moment was ripe to apply a touch of psychological press. Inspector Hargreaves, emboldened by Clara's revelation, had redoubled his efforts, questioning Julian Ashburn with renewed vigor about his financial dealings with Sir Rupert. Julian's defensive responses, coupled with his insistence that Clara had misspoken, only deepened the inspector's suspicions. Yet Miss Marple, watching from her corner, knew that the truth lay not in the obvious but in the subtle glance, a hesitation, a contradiction, the burnt ash, the footsteps, the cryptic letter, and now Clara's confession all pointed to a motive tied to Sir Rupert's death, and Miss Marple was determined to draw the culprit into the open. As the guests gathered in the drawing-room after dinner, Miss Marple proposed a suggestion to Inspector Hargreaves, her tone as mild as ever. "Inspector," she said, her needles clicking softly, "might it not be useful to bring everyone together and review the events of that evening? Sometimes, the act of recounting can jog a memory or reveal a slip." Hargreaves, though initially skeptical of the elderly spinster's involvement, had come to respect her keen observations. "A reconstruction, you mean," he said, stroking his mustache. "It's unorthodox, but it might shake something loose." "Very well, Miss Marple, we'll try it." The guests were summoned to the drawing-room, their faces a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Lady Eleanor, her regal bearing strained, took her place by the fireplace, while Julian and Clara sat close together, their hands clasped but their expressions tense. Dr. Caldwell, ever composed, stood by the window, his eyes watchful. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove perched on a sofa, her lips pursed in disapproval, while Tommy Ashburn slouched in a chair, his sullenness tinged with unease. Mr. Reginald Forbes, the solicitor, adjusted his spectacles, his face impassive but alert. Inspector Hargreaves began, his voice authoritative. "We're going to go over the evening of Miss Langley's murder, step by step," he said. "Each of you will state where you were and what you heard or saw. Let's start at 9:30, half an hour before the scream." Lady Eleanor spoke first, her voice steady. "I was in the drawing room, as were most of us. We were discussing trivial matters. I recall Miss Langley excusing herself around 9:40, saying she needed to fetch something from the library." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting the detail. Vivian's departure had gone unmentioned until now, a deliberate omission. Perhaps. She glanced at Julian, whose fingers tightened on Clara's hand. "I was here, too," Julian said, quickly, "talking with Forbes about business." Clara had gone upstairs earlier, around 9. Clara nodded, her voice trembling. I was in my room, as I said, but I went to the library just before 10, to speak to Vivian. She told me to leave, and I did." Hargreaves' eyes narrowed. "And you saw no one else in the corridor?" Clara shook her head, but her hesitation was palpable. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Tommy, who was staring at his shoes. "And you, Tommy?" she asked gently, her tone inviting trust. "You were on the terrace, I believe." Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, smoking. I heard footsteps upstairs, like I told you, around 10. Didn't see anyone." Dr. Caldwell cleared his throat. "I stepped into the hall to fetch my pipe. Around 9:50, he said. I was back in the drawing room by 10. When the scream came, Mrs. Hargrove sniffed. I never left this room," she said sharply. "I heard nothing until that dreadful scream." Forbes corroborated Julian's account, his voice dry. "We were discussing investments. I didn't notice anything unusual until the scream." Miss Marple listened, her mind cataloging the alibis. The accounts were consistent, yet they felt rehearsed, like lines in a play. She decided to apply a gentle nudge. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might we consider the brandy glass in the library?" It was half empty, yet no bottle was found. Perhaps someone brought the brandy to Miss Langley, a gesture of friendship, or something more. The room grew still, the guests' eyes darting to one another. Lady Eleanor's lips tightened, and Julian's face flushed. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" he demanded. "That one of us was in the library with her?" "Not implying, Mr. Ashburn," Miss Marple said calmly. "Merely observing. The glass suggests Miss Langley was not alone for long. And the letter she wrote, 'I know what happened last spring,' implies she had uncovered something about Sir Rupert's death. Perhaps someone wished to silence her." A gasp escaped Clara, and Dr. Caldwell's hand twitched, knocking his pipe to the floor. Mrs. Hargreaves' eyes widened, and even Tommy looked up, his sullen mask slipping. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice icy. "Miss Marple, this is speculation. Vivian was a novelist, prone to exaggeration. Her death is tragic, but to suggest it's tied to my husband's passing is unthinkable." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "Of course, Lady Eleanor, but the truth, like my knitting, requires patience to reveal its pattern." Hargreaves, sensing the rising tension, seized the moment. "Let's be clear," he said sternly. "Someone in this house stabbed Miss Langley. The letter opener was wiped clean, the window locked, the papers scattered. If anyone knows more than they've said, now is the time to speak." The silence that followed was heavy, each guest avoiding the other's eyes. Miss Marple watched closely, noting the way Dr. Caldwell's fingers trembled as he retrieved his pipe, and the quick glance Julian exchanged with Forbes. The trap had been set, she thought, and the culprit was beginning to feel its pressure. Her little gray cells were at work, and she knew that the next revelation would bring her closer to the truth. Chapter 10. The revealed drawing room at Crestwood Hall was suffused with a tense silence. As the third evening drew to a close, the starlit sky beyond the windows offering no relief from the oppressive atmosphere within, the guests gathered at Inspector Hargreaves' insistence sat in a semicircle, their faces etched with apprehension. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, occupied her usual corner by the hearth, her sharp blue eyes scanning the assembly with a quiet intensity. The trap she had helped set had stirred the waters, and now, she sensed, the truth was ready to surface. Her little gray cells had woven the clues into a pattern, and it was time to lay it bare. Inspector Hargreaves stood at the center of the room, his mustache bristling with authority. "We've heard your accounts," he said, his voice firm, "and we've pieced together the events of Miss Langley's murder. But there are contradictions, and tonight we'll resolve them. Miss Marple, you've been observant. Would you care to share your thoughts?" All eyes turned to the elderly spinster, whose serene expression belied the sharpness of her mind. She inclined her head, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Thank you, Inspector. The murder of Miss Vivian Langley is a puzzle, but like my knitting, every stitch counts. Let us begin with the facts." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Miss Langley was stabbed in the library at 10 o'clock. As the scream alerted us, the letter opener, wiped clean of fingerprints, suggests premeditation. The brandy glass, half empty with no bottle nearby, indicates she was not alone. The scattered papers, bearing the Ashburn crest, and her cryptic letter, "I know what happened last spring," point to a motive tied to Sir Rupert Ashburn's death. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap, but she remained silent. Julian Ashburn shifted uncomfortably, while Clara's eyes filled with tears. Dr. Caldwell's face was impassive, but his fingers gripped his pipe tightly. Mrs. Hargreaves' lips pursed, and Tommy stared at the floor, his sullenness masking unease. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. Vivian Langley was a novelist with a nose for secrets. Her question at dinner about Sir Rupert's ghost was no idle remark. It was a probe, meant to unsettle. She had been researching the Ashburn family, specifically Sir Rupert's death last spring, which was ruled heart failure. But Vivian suspected otherwise, and her letter suggests she had evidence. She turned to Clara. "Mrs. Ashburn, you admitted to visiting the library just before 10 to confront Vivian about her questions. You feared she suspected your husband, Julian, of wrongdoing in Sir Rupert's death. You saw her writing, and she told you to leave, saying it wasn't safe. This places you near the scene, but I believe you told the truth. You left before the murder." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. Julian's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Tommy. Young Tommy heard footsteps in the corridor, hurried ones, just before the scream. This suggests someone else was near the library, someone who did not wish to be seen. And then there is the ash I found outside the library door, fine, like burnt paper. Someone destroyed a document, perhaps one Vivian had found. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The key lies in Sir Rupert's death. Mr. Forbes, you mentioned Sir Rupert considered altering his will, a change that would have affected the family's inheritance. Julian, you owed Sir Rupert a significant debt, forgiven upon his death. Lady Eleanor, you inherited the bulk of the estate. And Dr. Caldwell, You certified Sir Rupert's death as heart failure, despite its suddenness. Dr. Caldwell's pipe slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. What are you implying, Miss Marple? He said, his voice strained. Not implying, Doctor, she said gently, concluding. You see, Vivian's research led her to suspect that Sir Rupert's death was no accident. She found a document, perhaps a draft of the new will, or evidence of poison, and she confronted someone about it in the library. That someone brought her brandy, a gesture to keep her talking. But when she refused to back down, they stabbed her with the letter opener, scattering the papers in their haste. Inspector Hargreaves leaned forward, his eyes keen. And who, Miss Marple, do you believe that someone is? Miss Marple's gaze settled on Dr. Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell, you were devoted to Sir Rupert, but also to Lady Eleanor. You knew Sir Rupert planned to change his will, reducing her inheritance to favor a distant relative. You also knew his health was failing, but not fatally. A small dose of poison, administered over time, could mimic heart failure. Vivian, with her sharp mind, found evidence, perhaps a medical record, or a vial's residue in the archives. She confronted you, didn't she? Caldwell's face drained of color. This is absurd, he stammered. I'm a doctor, not a murderer. And yet, Miss Marple said, her voice unrelenting, you stepped into the hall at 9:50, not to fetch your pipe, but to meet Vivian in the library. You brought the brandy, hoping to placate her, but when she threatened to expose you, you acted. The footsteps Tommy heard were yours, returning to the drawing room after the deed. The ash was from a document you burned to cover your tracks. The room was silent, the guests frozen. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice trembling. Henry, is this true? Caldwell's composure shattered, his hands shaking. I did it for you, Eleanor, he whispered. Rupert was going to leave you with nothing. I couldn't let that happen. A gasp rippled through the room. Inspector Hargreaves stepped forward, his voice grim. Dr. Henry Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murders of Vivian Langley and Sir Rupert Ashburn. As the sergeant led Caldwell away, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her face serene. The truth had been revealed, as she knew it would, through the careful unraveling of human nature's contradictions. The pattern was complete, and justice would follow. Chapter 11. The reflection. The arrest of Dr. Henry Caldwell cast a somber hush over Crestwood Hall, as though the very walls exhaled a long-held breath. The fog had lifted entirely, and the late evening sky gleamed with a clarity that seemed to mock the turmoil within. The guests, shaken by the revelation of not one but two murders, dispersed to their rooms, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sat by the dying fire, her mind still turning over the events that had unraveled the dark secrets of the Ashburn family. Inspector Hargreaves, his task complete, approached her with a rare note of deference. Miss Marple, he said, his mustache twitching slightly, I owe you a debt of gratitude. Your insight turned the tide. How did you know it was Caldwell? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, her smile gentle but knowing. It is not so much knowing, Inspector, as observing. People, you see, are like mine. Knitting, each stitch reveals a pattern, if one has the patience to follow it. Dr. Caldwell's devotion to Lady Eleanor was evident in his glances, his hesitations. The brandy glass, the burnt ash, the footsteps, these were threads, and they led to him. Hargreaves nodded, jotting a final note in his book. You've a remarkable mind, Miss Marple. We'd have pinned it on young Tommy without you." Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression thoughtful. Tommy was a convenient distraction, Inspector, but his sullenness was that of a boy caught in a family's secrets, not a murderer. Dr. Caldwell, however, acted out of loyalty, a misguided loyalty, but loyalty nonetheless. It is often the quiet ones, those who seem above suspicion, who harbor the deepest motives. The inspector closed his notebook, his expression one of grudging admiration. "Well, we've got our man, thanks to you. I'll see to it the report reflects your help." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile demure. "I require no credit, Inspector, only the satisfaction of seeing the truth brought to light." As Hargreaves departed to oversee Caldwell's transfer to the village station, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her thoughts drifting to the broader tapestry of human nature. She had seen it before, in her quiet village of St. Mary's Mead, the way love, fear, and greed could twist even the most respectable hearts. Dr. Caldwell had killed to protect Lady Eleanor's future, believing his actions justified. Vivian Langley, with her sharp mind and bolder heart, had paid the price for uncovering his crime. Lady Eleanor herself appeared in the doorway, her regal bearing softened by grief. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, I don't know how to thank you, or how to face what Henry has done." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her gaze kind but unflinching. "Lady Eleanor, the truth is a bitter medicine, but it heals in time. Dr. Caldwell's actions were his own, not yours. You must carry on, for the sake of Crestwood and your family." Lady Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "You're right, of course. I only wish I'd seen it sooner. Henry's devotion, Vivian's suspicions. Perhaps I could have stopped this." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "We cannot change the past, my dear, only learn from it." Vivian's curiosity was her undoing, but it was also her gift. She sought the truth, and in the end, she found it. Lady Eleanor managed a faint smile, then excused herself, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. The drawing room was quiet now, the fire reduced to embers, and Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Yet there was no triumph in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of the frailties of human nature. She thought of her village, of the small dramas that unfolded in its cottages and lanes, and how they mirrored the grand tragedies of places like Crestwood Hall. People, she mused, were the same everywhere, driven by love, fear, and secrets, their lives interwoven in patterns only the patient could discern. Gathering her knitting, Miss Marple rose and made her way to her room, her steps light but purposeful. The case was closed, the truth revealed, and her work here was done. Tomorrow, she would return to St. Mary's Mead, to her quiet cottage and her garden, where new puzzles would no doubt await. As she climbed the grand staircase, her little gray cells already at rest, she felt a quiet certainty. The truth, however hidden, could never long evade the patient observer. Chapter 12. The echoes of truth. Morning after Dr. Caldwell's arrest dawned bright and crisp. The first clear day Crestwood Hall had seen since the tragedy. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, but it did little to lift the somber mood that lingered among the guests. The revelation of not only Vivian Langley's murder but also Sir Rupert Ashburn's poisoning had left the household reeling, their carefully maintained facades shattered by the weight of truth. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table, with her tea and toast, observed the subdued gathering with her usual quiet acuity. her knitting tucked beside her as a silent companion to her thoughts. Lady Eleanor, though pale and drawn, maintained her dignity as she presided over the meal, her voice steady as she directed the servants. Julian and Clara Ashburn sat close together, their hands occasionally touching, as if seeking reassurance in the wake of their exposed secrets. Mr. Reginald Forbes, the solicitor, ate in silence, his spectacles glinting as he avoided eye contact. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, her sharp tongue unusually subdued, picked at her food, while young Tommy Ashburn, no longer the prime suspect, seemed almost relieved. Though his sullen demeanor persisted, the absence of Dr. Caldwell was a palpable void, his chair at the table left empty, a silent testament to his betrayal. Miss Marple's mind, ever active, turned over the events of the previous night. The pattern of the case was complete, yet she knew that truth, once revealed, often left echoes ripples of consequence that could unsettle a household. Long after the culprit was apprehended, she noted the way Julian's gaze lingered on Lady Eleanor, a mix of guilt and gratitude, and the faint tremor in Clara's hands as she sipped her tea. The family's financial troubles, tied to Sir Rupert's estate, had been laid bare, and Miss Marple suspected that more conversations, perhaps difficult ones, lay ahead for the Ashburns. After breakfast, Inspector Hargreaves sought out Miss Marple in the morning room, where she had settled with her knitting. His manner was less brisk than usual, tempered by a newfound respect. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her, "I've spoken with the chief constable, and he's impressed with your work. You've a gift for seeing what others miss." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her smile modest. "You are too kind, Inspector. I merely observe, as I have always done in my little village. People are much the same, whether in St. Mary's, Mead, or a grand estate like this. They guard their secrets, but secrets have a way of betraying themselves." Hargreaves nodded, his notebook closed for once. "Caldwell's confessed fully," he said. "He admitted to poisoning Sir Rupert with small doses of digitalis, disguised as a heart tonic. He thought it would secure Lady Eleanor's inheritance. When Miss Langley started asking questions, he panicked. She'd found a vial in the archives, labeled with the pharmacy's mark, and confronted him in the library." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "The vial, of course," she said softly, "and the burnt ash I found was likely the label, destroyed to hide the evidence. Poor Miss Langley, she was too bold for her own good." The inspector leaned forward, curious. "How did you piece it together, Miss Marple? The brandy glass, the footsteps, what made you suspect Caldwell over the others?" Miss Marple paused, her needles still. "It was the brandy glass, Inspector, that first caught my attention. A half-empty glass, with no bottle nearby, suggested a deliberate act, someone bringing Vivian a drink to keep her talking. Dr. Caldwell's devotion to Lady Eleanor was evident in his glances, his protectiveness. The footsteps Tommy heard, the ash from a burned document, the letter opener wiped clean, all pointed to a man accustomed to precision, like a physician. And his pipe, dropped in the drawing room when I mentioned the brandy, betrayed his nerves." Hargreaves shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'd have missed half of that." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. "It is only a matter of looking closely, Inspector. In my village, I have seen many small dramas, jealousy, greed, loyalty misplaced. They are the same here, only dressed in finer clothes." As the inspector took his leave, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Ashburn family, Julian's financial troubles, Clara's fear, and Lady Eleanor's grief were wounds that would take time to heal. She rose, intending to take a final walk through the grounds before her departure, and found Tommy Ashburn on the terrace, staring at the distant hills. "Tommy," she said gently, approaching him, "you seem lighter today. The truth, though painful, has set you free." The boy shrugged, but his eyes were less guarded. "I thought they'd lock me up," he admitted. "I didn't do anything, but I knew something wasn't right about Sir Rupert's death. Vivian asked me about it once, said she was writing a book. I didn't tell her much, but I think she guessed." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze kind. "You were wise to stay silent, Tommy. The truth has a way of finding its own path." As she walked back to the house, Miss Marple reflected on the echoes of truth that lingered in Crestwood Hall. Vivian Langley's curiosity had cost her life, but it had also brought justice to Sir Rupert's memory. Dr. Caldwell's loyalty, twisted into murder, was a reminder of the dangers of love unchecked by reason. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her little gray cells, had once again unraveled the pattern of human nature. She would leave Crestwood Hall tomorrow, returning to the simplicity of St. Mary's Mead. But the lessons of this case would stay with her. Truth, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily buried but never truly lost. And as long as she had her knitting and her keen eye, she would be ready to uncover it, wherever it hid. Chapter 13. The unraveling threads. The morning sun bathed Crestwood Hall in a golden light, softening the stark outlines of its ancient stone and lending an air of deceptive tranquility to the estate. The guests, though free from the immediate threat of suspicion, moved with a subdued caution, as if the revelations of Dr. Caldwell's crimes had left an indelible mark on their spirits. Miss Jane Marple, preparing for her departure to St. Mary's Mead, sat in the morning room with a cup of tea, her knitting resting in her lap. Her sharp blue eyes, however, were as active as ever, noting the lingering tensions among the Ashburn family and their guests. The arrest of Dr. Caldwell had resolved the mystery of Vivian Langley's murder and Sir Rupert Ashburn's poisoning. But Miss Marple knew that truth, once uncovered, often left threads dangling, questions unanswered, relationships strained. She observed the breakfast table with her usual quiet intensity. Lady Eleanor, her regal composure now tinged with a weary resignation. Julian and Clara Ashburn, their closeness marred by whispered arguments. Mr. Reginald Forbes, the solicitor, whose detachment seemed a shield against the family's turmoil. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, her sharp tongue softened by the weight of events, and young Tommy, whose sullenness had given way to a tentative openness. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Eleanor, who approached with a hesitant smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I cannot thank you enough for your clarity in this dreadful affair. You've saved us from further tragedy, though the cost has been great." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression gentle. "The cost of truth is often high, Lady Eleanor, but it is a price worth paying. Your family can now begin to heal, though it will take time." Lady Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "Henry's betrayal. I never suspected. He was so devoted, so trusted. How could I have been so blind?" Miss Marple's needles, though still, seemed to echo her thoughts. "We are all blind to those we trust, my dear," she said softly. "Dr. Caldwell acted out of a misguided love, but love, unchecked, can lead to ruin. You must not blame yourself." As Lady Eleanor excused herself, Miss Marple's mind turned to the remaining threads of the case. Clara's confession had been pivotal. But her fear of Julian's reaction suggested deeper fissures in their marriage. Julian's financial troubles, tied to Sir Rupert's forgiven debt, hinted at pressures that might yet surface. And Tommy's admission of hearing footsteps, though it had pointed to Caldwell, also suggested he had known more than he let on. Miss Marple decided to have one final conversation before her departure. She found Tommy in the garden, tossing pebbles into a small fountain, his expression thoughtful. "Tommy," she said, approaching with her usual warmth, "you've been through quite an ordeal. I wonder if there's anything more you'd like to share, now that the truth is out." Tommy glanced up, his eyes wary but less guarded than before. "I told you about the footsteps," he said. "That's all I heard. But Vivian did talk to me a bit before. She asked about Sir Rupert's last days, if I'd seen anything odd. I didn't think much of it then, but she seemed scared, like she'd found something she didn't expect." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the confirmation of Vivian's suspicions. "And did you notice anything unusual about Sir Rupert's death?" she asked gently. Tommy hesitated, then shrugged. "He was sick for a while, but Dr. Caldwell said it was his heart. I saw him give Sir Rupert medicine a few times, little drops in his tea. I thought it was normal." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The drops, she knew, were likely the digitalis Caldwell had confessed to administering. Tommy's observation, though innocent, had been a vital clue, had she known to ask sooner. "You've been very helpful, Tommy," she said. "Sometimes the smallest details make the greatest difference." As she returned to the house, Miss Marple reflected on the unraveling threads of the case. The vial Vivian had found, the burnt ash, the brandy glass, all had pointed to Caldwell's guilt. But they also revealed the fragility of the Ashburn family's bonds. Julian's debts, Clara's fear, Lady Eleanor's grief, these were wounds that would linger. Even as justice was served in the hall, she encountered Mr. Forbes, who was preparing to leave for London. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "you've done the family a great service. The estate's affairs will be complicated, but I'll ensure they're handled properly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have no doubt, Mr. Forbes. But do take care, secrets have a way of lingering, even in documents." Forbes' eyes flickered, but he nodded and took his leave. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind considering the will that had nearly been changed, and the motives it had sparked. The case was closed, but the echoes of truth would resonate in Crestwood Hall for years to come. As she packed her small suitcase, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Her little gray cells had unraveled another puzzle, revealing the patterns of human nature that lay beneath. She would return to St. Mary's Mead, to her cottage and her garden, but she knew that wherever there were people, there would be secrets, and she would be ready to uncover them. Chapter 14. The final stitches. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Crestwood Hall, its rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the drive, as if to bid farewell to the turmoil that had gripped the estate. Miss Jane Marple, her suitcase packed and her knitting carefully stowed, stood in the grand hall, ready to depart for St. Mary's Mead. The house, though still imposing, seemed quieter now, its secrets laid bare by her meticulous unraveling. Yet, as was her habit, Miss Marple's mind lingered on the final stitches of the case, ensuring no loose threads remained to fray the fabric of truth. The guests had begun to disperse, their farewells tinged with a mixture of relief and unease. Lady Eleanor, ever the gracious hostess, had insisted on arranging a car to take Miss Marple to the station, her gratitude tempered by the weight of recent events. Julian and Clara Ashburn. Their marriage strained by the revelations of Julian's financial dealings, spoken in hushed tones by the staircase, their future uncertain. Mr. Reginald Forbes had already left for London, his briefcase bulging with documents that would, no doubt, shape the Ashburn estate's future. Mrs. Beatrice Hargrove, her sharp edges softened by the ordeal, had retired to her room, while young Tommy Ashburn lingered on the terrace, his expression more thoughtful than sullen. Miss Marple's final conversation at Crestwood Hall came unexpectedly. As she encountered Clara Ashburn in the hall, her face pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly, "I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't pressed for the truth, I might have carried my secret forever." It was a relief to speak, even if it caused pain. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her smile kind but perceptive. "My dear, the truth is like a wound, it may hurt to cleanse, but it heals cleanly in time. You were brave to come forward, and your honesty helped bring justice." Clara's lips quivered, and she clutched her handkerchief. "Julian's angry with me, but I couldn't lie any more. Vivian's death, Sir Rupert's, it was all too much. I only wish I'd spoken sooner, before things went so far." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the weight of Clara's words. The young woman's confession had been the key to unlocking Dr. Caldwell's guilt, but it had also exposed the fragility of her marriage. Julian's debts, tied to Sir Rupert's death, had created a web of deceit that Vivian Langley had unwittingly stumbled into. "You did what was right, Clara," Miss Marple said gently, "and that is no small thing." As Clara excused herself, Miss Marple took a final turn through the drawing room, her eyes lingering on the hearth where she had spent so many hours observing the brandy glass, the burnt ash, the footsteps Tommy had heard. These clues had formed the pattern, but it was the human heart that had woven them together. Dr. Caldwell's devotion to Lady Eleanor, twisted into murder, was a reminder of how love could curdle into obsession. Vivian's bold curiosity, though fatal, had ensured that truth prevailed. Lady Eleanor appeared, her regal bearing softened by a quiet sorrow. "Miss Marple," she said, extending a hand, "your presence here was a blessing, though I confess I did not expect it. You've given us a chance to rebuild, however painful the process." Miss Marple clasped her hand, her grip firm despite her delicate appearance. "Rebuilding is never easy, Lady Eleanor, but it is possible with honesty. Crestwood Hall has seen much, but it will endure, as you will." Lady Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she managed a nod. "I hope so, and I hope you'll visit again, under happier circumstances." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps, my dear, but my little village keeps me busy enough with its own small dramas." As the car arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple stepped outside, her reticule in hand, and took a final look at Crestwood Hall. The case had been a complex one, its threads tangled with greed, loyalty, and secrets. Yet, as always, her little gray cells had found the pattern, unraveling the truth stitch by stitch. She thought of St. Mary's Mead, where her cottage and garden awaited, and of the inevitable puzzles that would arise among its familiar faces. Human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere, and she would be ready to meet it with her quiet observation and unerring insight. The car rolled down the drive, the hall receding into the distance, and Miss Marple settled back, her mind already turning to the next mystery that awaited her. The final stitches were in place, and the tapestry of Crestwood Hall was complete for now. Chapter 15. The quiet departure of the train to St. Mary's Mead rolled steadily through the Somerset countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil Miss Jane Marple had left behind at Crestwood Hall. Seated by the window, her reticule resting on her lap and her knitting tucked neatly inside, Miss Marple gazed at the passing fields, their golden hues softened by the late afternoon light. The case of Vivian Langley's murder and Sir Rupert Ashburn's poisoning was solved. Yet her mind lingered on the human frailties that had woven such a tragic tapestry. Her little gray cells, though at rest, were never truly idle. The events at Crestwood Hall had unfolded like one of her intricate knitting patterns, each clue a stitch that, when carefully joined, revealed the whole. The brandy glass, the burnt ash, the footsteps in the corridor, Vivian's cryptic letter, all had pointed to Dr. Henry Caldwell's desperate act to protect Lady Eleanor's inheritance. His confession had laid bare a motive rooted in loyalty and love, twisted into something dark and deadly. Miss Marple, with her quiet observation and unerring insight, had unraveled the truth, but she took no pride in it. To her, solving a mystery was not a triumph but a necessity, a way to restore order to a world disrupted by human folly. As the train neared her village, Miss Marple reflected on the echoes of the case that would linger at Crestwood Hall. Lady Eleanor, burdened by betrayal, would face the challenge of rebuilding her family's legacy. Julian and Clara Ashburn, their marriage strained by secrets and financial woes, would need to find a path forward if they could. Young Tommy, freed from suspicion, might yet find his place in a family scarred by scandal, and Mr. Reginald Forbes, with his dry efficiency, would no doubt navigate the legal complexities of Sir Rupert's estate, ensuring the Ashburn name endured. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Vivian Langley, the bold young novelist whose curiosity had been her undoing. Her question about Sir Rupert's ghost had sparked the chain of events, a spark that ignited hidden truths. In her village, Miss Marple had known many like Vivian, bright, inquisitive souls who probed too deeply into others' secrets. Their fates were not always tragic, but they were always instructive, reminding her that truth, while precious, often came at a cost. The train slowed as it approached St. Mary's Mead, the familiar spire of the church visible in the distance. Miss Marple gathered her reticule, her movements deliberate and calm. She thought of her cottage, with its neat garden and cozy parlor, where a fire would be waiting. There, she would resume her quiet life, tending to her roses and listening to the small dramas of her neighbors. But she knew that wherever there were people, there would be puzzles, jealousies, fears, and secrets waiting to be unraveled. As she stepped onto the platform, the cool air of home enveloped her, and she felt a quiet contentment. The case at Crestwood Hall had been a complex one, its threads tangled with greed, loyalty, and betrayal. Yet, through patience and observation, she had found the pattern, as she always did. Her little gray cells had served her well, and they would again when the next mystery called. With a final glance at the receding train, Miss Marple set off toward her cottage, her steps light and purposeful. The world was full of secrets, but none could hide forever from a mind as keen as hers. And so, with her knitting and her insight, she would continue to weave the truth, stitch by careful stitch, in the quiet corners of St. Mary's Mead.